3 days had passed since Savannah inherited $33 million, and I was still trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Just a week ago, she had been my sweet, sometimes stubborn little girl, and now she barely looked at me without an air of impatience. I thought moving in for a short while to help her settle into her new life would be appreciated. I never imagined I would be pushed out of my own daughter's house like an unwelcome guest. The morning it happened, I had been in the kitchen making coffee when Savannah came in, dressed in designer clothes, checking her phone, and barely acknowledging me. She told me she needed space and that I should find somewhere else to stay. Her voice was firm, and there was no hint of hesitation. I tried to speak, tried to reason, but she interrupted me. She said she needed to handle her new life on her own and that my presence was making things complicated. Then, without another word, she walked away, leaving me in disbelief. I stood in that kitchen, staring at the countertop I had polished so many times, feeling the sharp sting of betrayal. How could my own child turn on me so quickly, just because money had come into her life? It was hard not to cry, but I forced myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that this was Savannah, spoiled by sudden wealth, blinded by greed, and forgetting the woman who had raised her. I packed a small bag, barely touching the beautiful house she had bought with her inheritance. Every corner of the house reminded me of her excitement the day she signed the papers, and now it felt like a prison built for someone else entirely. Outside, the sun shone, but it didn't warm me. The world felt unfair and sharp. I wondered how a bond that had taken decades to build could be broken in a single day. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of years of sacrifice pressing down on me. I had worked hard, raising Savannah alone after her father passed. I had nursed her through fevers, school projects, heartbreaks, and moments when she thought the world was against her. And now, in the blink of an eye, she had forgotten it all. The thought made my chest tighten, but I refused to let despair take over. Even though I had nowhere to go immediately, a small voice inside me whispered that this wasn't the end. If anything, it was the beginning of a new chapter. I could feel anger and sadness swirling together, but there was also clarity. Savannah had shown me who she really was. That knowledge, painful as it was, also gave me power. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let her betrayal define me. I started the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The neighborhood I had called home for years was behind me, and ahead lay uncertainty. But I reminded myself that I had survived far worse in life. Losing my home, even if temporarily, would not break me. This was just the first test, and I was determined to come out stronger, ready to face whatever Savannah threw my way. The real story was only beginning. After that morning, I found myself without a home, carrying a small bag of belongings and trying not to let the cold reality sink in. Friends offered me a place to stay temporarily, and I accepted, grateful but embarrassed. Sitting in their living room that first night, I couldn't stop thinking about Savannah. The girl I had raised, the one I had worked day and night for, had thrown me out as if I were a stranger. The depth of her greed and entitlement was staggering. Money had changed her overnight, and it hurt more than I could explain. James, my next-door neighbor for years, came by one afternoon with a plate of food. Quiet and observant, he had always been a steady presence in my life, and now he seemed more concerned than ever. He didn't sugarcoat things. "Margaret," he said softly, "sometimes people who suddenly get everything they want forget what really matters. Don't be surprised if her world starts crumbling around her." I wanted to hope he was wrong, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't. As the days passed, I noticed small things. Savannah called a few friends to boast about her inheritance, spending recklessly and expecting everyone to cater to her whims. Her entitlement was on full display, and I felt a mix of anger and sadness. I missed the daughter I knew, the girl who used to laugh with me over breakfast and talk about her dreams. That bond seemed gone, replaced by a hollow shell focused only on money and status. I spent long nights awake, thinking about all the years I had given to raise her. I had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and sometimes my own happiness to make sure she had everything she needed. And now, that love and effort were met with coldness. It felt unjust, cruel even. I kept asking myself how someone could forget the person who had been there through every hardship, every success. The pain of that realization made it hard to focus, yet a part of me started to harden. During this time, I also began reflecting on my own life outside Savannah's shadow. Without the house to care for, without constant reminders of her presence, I found a strange clarity. I realized I had strength I hadn't fully recognized before, and that strength gave me a quiet resolve. I would not let her betrayal define my life. James noticed my change in demeanor. He didn't push, didn't offer advice I hadn't asked for, but he reminded me that I had value, experience, and wisdom that no amount of money could buy. That simple reassurance became a lifeline. Slowly, I started to see that Savannah's world, built entirely on wealth and vanity, might not be as solid as she believed. And in that thought, I found the first spark of hope that things could eventually turn in my favor. Every day without Savannah around was painful, but it also became a lesson. Love and family can be fragile, but personal strength and dignity are something no one can take away. I realized that even if Savannah had thrown me out, she had also revealed who she truly was, and that knowledge might one day shift the balance. I finally found a small apartment not far from my old neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of control over my own life. I unpacked my few belongings slowly, enjoying the quiet and the simple routine. Without Savannah's demands, I could breathe, think, and make decisions for myself. It was strange, almost unfamiliar, but freeing. I started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in years. Afternoon coffee dates, long walks, and simple dinners reminded me that life could still be full of warmth without wealth or extravagance. Their laughter and concern helped patch the sting of Savannah's betrayal. Each conversation made me stronger, more grounded, and less dependent on a daughter who had proven she could be cruel. Meanwhile, Savannah's world moved in the opposite direction. From a distance, I could see her hosting extravagant parties at her new mansion. The news traveled quickly through neighbors and old friends. Her house was overflowing with expensive food, champagne, and people who barely knew her outside of her wealth. She laughed loudly, showing off designer clothes, jewelry, and flashy cars. I noticed the type of people she attracted: shallow, greedy, and eager to get closer to her money. It was painful to watch, but it also confirmed what I already suspected: her new life was built on surface-level admiration, not true friendship or love. Instead of rushing to confront her, I decided to observe quietly. I took note of the way her friends acted, how quickly they changed moods when things didn't go their way, and how dependent her social circle had become on her fortune. I didn't interfere or warn her. There was no need. Watching her from afar, I started seeing patterns, small cracks in her carefully built facade. Every reckless purchase, every careless decision, became part of a bigger picture I could learn from. I also began to enjoy my independence in little ways. Cooking exactly what I wanted, rearranging my apartment, and setting my own schedule reminded me that life could be simpler and still fulfilling. It was strange to feel happiness without the shadow of Savannah looming over me. That sense of freedom gave me confidence I hadn't realized I still had. More than anything, I started to feel a quiet power growing inside me. Savannah had thought her money gave her control over everything, but from my apartment, I could see how fragile her world really was. The arrogance and greed she displayed were like cracks in glass. Eventually, they would lead to something breaking. I didn't need to push or interfere, I simply needed patience and observation. With each passing day, my heartbreak faded slightly, replaced by clarity. I realized that my life could continue without her approval or love. And somewhere beneath the pain, a slow plan for justice began to form, not through confrontation, but through timing, patience, and the quiet knowledge that someday, Savannah's choices would come back to her. I had regained my freedom, and with it, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. A few weeks into her new life, Savannah ran into her first real problem. One of her most trusted financial advisors, a man she had relied on since the inheritance, made a careless, or maybe deliberate, mistake that cost her several $1,000,000. The news hit her hard. For someone used to instant gratification and constant praise, this was a shock. She called me once, her voice tense and frustrated, but I didn't rush to help. I had learned to watch and wait. From my apartment, I could follow the ripple effects of her loss without being part of the chaos. Savannah's confident facade began to crack. She became irritable with her friends, defensive when questioned, and more desperate to control every detail of her life. I could hear the whispers of her social circle, friends expressing concern about how quickly she was burning through her fortune. It was fascinating, in a quiet, painful way, to see someone so used to control start losing it. I stayed calm during this time. The anger and betrayal I had felt when she threw me out were still there, but I let them sit beneath the surface. Acting too soon would have been pointless. Savannah needed to feel the consequences of her own choices. Watching her stumble made me realize how her arrogance and lack of experience were catching up with her. She had built her life on money and attention, and suddenly those things weren't enough. Savannah called a few more times, panicking about investments and asking vague questions that hinted she didn't really understand what had gone wrong. I listened quietly, careful not to give advice. Instead of fixing her mistakes, I reminded myself that this was part of her education, the hard way, the way that teaches humility and respect. It was painful to hear her fear, but I also felt a strange satisfaction in knowing she was starting to see life outside her perfect, wealthy bubble. As she lost her usual grip on everything, small cracks began showing in her personality. The loud confidence, the impatience, the disregard for anyone outside her world of wealth, they all started to falter. From my vantage point, I could see her frustration growing, each day a little more, each misstep a little bigger. I didn't need to intervene. Savannah was learning lessons that money alone could never teach. This first warning was crucial. It reminded me that even someone as reckless as Savannah could face consequences. And it reminded me that patience was my greatest ally. I could feel the tide slowly turning. While Savannah panicked, I stayed steady, quietly observing, taking mental notes for the moment when I would have the upper hand. For the first time since she had thrown me out, I felt a sense of control. Savannah's mistakes weren't just hers, they were lessons for both of us, lessons that would shape the next steps. I didn't act yet, but I could see the beginnings of a shift. Her world, built entirely on wealth and ego, was starting to wobble, and I was ready to watch it carefully, quietly, until the time was right. By now, Savannah's confidence was starting to crumble, and I saw an opportunity, not for cruelty, but for justice. I began using the knowledge I had gathered over the years about her investments, her business contacts, and even the people she surrounded herself with. I didn't act openly. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I moved quietly, like a shadow observing the chaos she had created for herself. I reached out to a few old colleagues and friends who still had connections in the financial world. Without revealing my intentions, I shared small truths about Savannah's reckless choices and her tendency to exaggerate her knowledge. Slowly, I noticed her circle reacting. Friends who had once fawned over her suddenly hesitated. They started questioning decisions she had made or pointing out inconsistencies in her stories. The arrogance that had drawn people to her began to push them away, and she didn't understand why. Savannah's social gatherings, once crowded with people eager to bask in her wealth, began thinning out. Invitations were ignored, and whispers followed her wherever she went. I watched quietly, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor. She was frustrated, increasingly defensive, and less certain of herself. The girl who had thrown me out in anger was now struggling to maintain the image she had worked so hard to create. Through it all, I stayed calm. I never gloated, never interfered in a way that could backfire on me. Instead, I let my actions be invisible, letting the consequences of Savannah's choices unfold naturally. Every misstep she made, every inconsistency exposed, strengthened my sense of control. I wasn't just a mother who had been betrayed, I was a strategist, patient and deliberate, letting the world correct the arrogance that had hurt me so deeply. This process also changed me. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need her approval or her gratitude to feel powerful. I was no longer simply a victim of betrayal. Each day, I grew more confident, more self-assured, and more aware of the impact I could have without showing it. My focus was not on revenge in a traditional sense, there was no malice, but on teaching a subtle lesson through consequences. Even in the quiet, I felt satisfaction. Seeing Savannah's friends hesitate to support her, seeing the cracks in her social circle widen, reminded me that wealth alone didn't guarantee loyalty or respect. And while she struggled to maintain the image she had so desperately clung to, I was building something far more enduring, my own strength, independence, and clarity. By observing, influencing quietly, and allowing the consequences to unfold, I began to reclaim the power that Savannah had tried to strip from me. I was no longer the woman who had been pushed out, I was someone who could shape the situation without being seen, someone who could turn betrayal into a lesson in patience and subtle authority. And with each passing day, I felt closer to the moment when Savannah would finally realize that her world wasn't as perfect as she thought, and that her arrogance had a price. A few weeks later, Savannah's problems escalated. One of her major investments collapsed unexpectedly, wiping out millions of dollars almost overnight. She had ignored warning signs, trusted the wrong people, and acted recklessly. From the outside, it was easy to see the damage, and I could feel a sense of inevitability about it. Her world, built entirely on wealth and ego, was starting to crumble. That evening, her phone rang. It was Savannah, and I recognized the tone immediately, something between hesitation and forced control. She tried to sound calm, even proud, but her voice betrayed the tension she was trying to hide. She asked if I could give her advice, if I could help her navigate the disaster she had caused. It wasn't a simple request for help, it was pride wrapped around desperation. I listened carefully, letting her speak without interruption. Every word, every pause, told me more about how far she had fallen and how blind she had been to the consequences of her actions. I could feel the role reversal taking shape. This time, she was the one who needed me, even if she didn't want to admit it. Instead of rushing to fix her mistakes, I approached the conversation differently. I didn't answer her immediately. I asked questions that made her think, questions that forced her to take responsibility for her own choices. I let her frustration grow, letting her feel the weight of the problem she had created. I could sense her unease rising, the arrogance and certainty she had once worn like armor were faltering. As she stumbled over her explanations, I realized the shift in power. For the first time, Savannah was not in control. She couldn't dictate the outcome, and she couldn't rely on her money alone to solve the problem. I began to negotiate subtly, setting conditions for how I would help, conditions that emphasized accountability, humility, and respect. It wasn't about punishment, but about showing her that life wasn't a game to be won with wealth alone. By the end of the call, Savannah sounded drained, frustrated, and uneasy. She hadn't expected me to stay calm or to demand anything from her. I, on the other hand, felt a quiet satisfaction. The dynamic between us had changed. I was no longer the one being hurt and pushed aside, I was the one who could guide, advise, and influence, all while maintaining my dignity and strength. That night, after hanging up, I reflected on how quickly things could change. Savannah's desperation was real, even if she tried to hide it. And I realized that my patience and careful observation had brought me to this point. The girl who had once thrown me out was now looking to me for guidance. The emotional tension was thick, and I knew that the coming days would test both her humility and my ability to remain in control. For the first time, I felt the balance shifting. Savannah's arrogance had been tempered by loss, and I had gained a quiet power, one that could shape her actions and decisions if I chose. The stage was set for the next steps, and I was ready to move with patience, strategy, and the calm certainty that comes from knowing the truth about someone who once betrayed you. The day finally came when Savannah showed up at my apartment, unannounced. Her expression was tense, her usual confidence replaced by unease. The expensive clothes and flashy jewelry couldn't hide the frustration and fear in her eyes. I knew immediately that this wasn't a social call, this was a confrontation, but not the kind I had expected. She walked in, trying to maintain a calm tone, but her words betrayed her. "Mom. I really need your help," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I made some mistakes, and I don't know what to do next. Please, you have to help me." I studied her carefully, seeing the mix of pride and desperation that had become her signature. She was begging, yet trying to hold on to control, as if asking for help was a weakness she couldn't fully accept. I didn't respond immediately. I let her words hang in the air. My anger and disappointment were still very real. After the silence stretched long enough for her to notice, I finally spoke. Savannah, do you know how it felt to be thrown out of your own house by your daughter? Do you understand the hurt you caused? My voice was steady but sharp, and I could see her flinch. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a child again. I didn't think, she started, but I cut her off. You didn't think? You inherited millions and thought it gave you the right to forget the woman who raised you. The one who spent decades supporting you, sacrificing for you? My words were honest, raw, and heavy with years of pain. Savannah's posture slumped slightly, the arrogance that had once filled the room disappearing. She realized, in that instant, that her actions had consequences beyond money. She tried to explain, tried to justify her behavior, but every excuse fell flat. I could see the shame building behind her eyes, the first real recognition of how cruel she had been. I didn't agree to help immediately. I wanted her to understand that apologies alone couldn't erase the betrayal. My anger wasn't about the money she lost, it was about the trust, the love, and the respect she had thrown aside. I told her plainly, I will help you, but you need to understand the pain you caused. You need to see that your actions have consequences, and you need to learn humility. The room was heavy with tension. Savannah's voice trembled as she admitted she had been wrong, her pride finally giving way to vulnerability. For the first time, I felt the balance shifting. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a mother who had been wronged, and I had the power to decide how to respond. That confrontation wasn't just about money or mistakes, it was about recognition, respect, and accountability. Savannah had begged, but I held the weight of my years of sacrifice firmly in place. The emotional truth was clear, betrayal leaves scars, but lessons, when learned, can rebuild trust, if someone is willing to face them. And Savannah, for the first time, was forced to do exactly that. After that emotional confrontation, I finally agreed to help Savannah, but not without setting strict conditions. I knew this wasn't just about fixing her financial mistakes, it was about teaching her responsibility, humility, and respect. I wanted her to understand that life wasn't a series of shortcuts and that her actions had real consequences. I sat her down in my apartment and laid out my terms clearly. She would not get a free pass. First, she had to admit her mistakes completely, without excuses. Second, she had to take active steps to make things right, reaching out to advisors, correcting errors, and learning from the consequences. Third, she had to treat everyone involved, including me, with respect. No more arrogance, no more entitlement. I wasn't helping out of obligation, I was helping because I could see a chance for her to grow. Savannah listened carefully, though her pride showed in subtle ways. I could see her weighing my words, trying to decide if she could follow through. Then I gave her the ultimate test. I handed her a small stack of documents and a list of tasks that would take effort, patience, and accountability. I told her, if you truly want my help, you will handle this without complaining or expecting shortcuts. Your sincerity will show through your actions, not just your words. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the papers, and for the first time, I saw a hint of fear mixed with determination in her eyes. It was a small, intense moment, but it said everything. She could either rise to the challenge or fall back into her old habits. I didn't soften my stance. This was a test not just of her abilities, but of her character. Over the next few days, I watched from a distance as Savannah worked. She called occasionally, not for excuses or complaints, but for guidance. She made tough choices, admitted when she had been wrong, and faced advisors and peers she had previously dismissed. Every step she took was a small proof of sincerity. I didn't intervene unless absolutely necessary, letting her feel the weight of responsibility. The suspense was constant. I could see the tension in her actions, the fear of failure, the frustration with herself, and the quiet pride of learning something new. It was a test of patience for both of us. For Savannah, it was a chance to prove she could handle life beyond her money. For me, it was proof that my years of guidance hadn't been wasted and that she could still learn to value respect and humility. By the end of the week, I sensed the shift. Savannah was no longer the reckless, entitled girl who had thrown me out. She was beginning to understand consequences and accountability. The ultimate test had worked, not through force or anger, but through patience, structure, and letting her face reality. It was a turning point. She wasn't just asking for help anymore, she was starting to earn it, and I finally saw the possibility of real change in her. After days of facing the consequences of her mistakes, Savannah began to change. She had lost money, shaken friendships, and seen firsthand how fragile her life could be when built only on wealth and pride. Slowly, she realized that her arrogance and sense of entitlement had nearly destroyed everything she cared about. For the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be responsible and humble. One afternoon, she came to my apartment again. This time, her voice was quiet, respectful, and sincere. "Mom," she said, "I know I've been wrong. I didn't appreciate everything you did for me, and I let my pride take over. I'm sorry. I really am." There were no excuses, no deflections, just honesty. I could see that she had learned something deeper than money or material success. She had learned about respect, trust, and the value of family. I listened carefully, feeling a mix of relief and lingering pain. Her words were important, but her actions over the past days had shown me that she truly understood. I decided it was time to help her, but on terms that reflected both lessons learned and boundaries respected. I offered guidance on how to fix her investments, how to approach her advisors, and how to rebuild her relationships. Every suggestion was met with gratitude, not entitlement. Helping her now didn't feel like enabling her, it felt like closure. I had been hurt, betrayed, and dismissed, but the quiet patience I had maintained allowed her to reach this point on her own. It was a powerful reminder that revenge doesn't have to be cruel or vengeful. Sometimes the strongest form of justice is patience and timing. By letting Savannah face the results of her actions, I had turned betrayal into a lesson she couldn't ignore. Watching her work through her mistakes, I noticed subtle changes in her personality. She was more attentive, less defensive, and genuinely considerate of others' advice. The people who had been drawn to her wealth began to respect her for her effort and determination, not just her money. It was a slow transformation, but one that was rooted in real understanding rather than fear or coercion. For me, the experience was equally transformative. I felt stronger, more confident, and proud of the way I had handled the situation. I hadn't retaliated with anger or humiliation, I had remained steady, patient, and wise. The lessons Savannah learned were mirrored by the strength I discovered in myself, the ability to set boundaries, hold firm, and demand respect without aggression. By the end, Savannah's apology and her sincere effort to recover brought a sense of emotional closure. The betrayal that had once cut so deeply had become a turning point for both of us. I had helped her not because I owed her, but because she had shown that she could grow, learn, and face her mistakes. And in that moment, I realized that real power doesn't come from money or revenge, it comes from patience, strength, and the courage to let others learn the hard way while keeping your own dignity intact. After weeks of tension, hard lessons, and careful observation, Savannah and I finally reached a place of reconciliation, but on my terms. This wasn't about a simple apology or pretending the past never happened. It was about respect, accountability, and proving that she had truly learned from her mistakes. I could see it in her eyes. She understood that our relationship would only move forward if she honored the effort, sacrifice, and love I had given her all these years. We started slowly. Savannah listened without interruption, accepted guidance, and followed through on the responsibilities I set for her. Every step she took showed growth. She wasn't the same arrogant, reckless girl who had thrown me out just weeks ago. Instead, she was cautious, humble, and willing to admit when she didn't know something. It was clear she had learned that money alone couldn't buy respect or loyalty, and that real strength comes from character, not wealth. As we rebuilt our connection, I realized how much I had grown too. Losing my home, facing betrayal, and observing Savannah's reckless choices had been painful, but they had also made me stronger and more independent. I was no longer defined by my daughter's actions or by the wealth she inherited. I had my own space, my own control over my life, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had handled everything with patience and dignity. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was in control of my life, and Savannah had learned that respect must be earned, not demanded. I could help her, guide her, and even forgive, but it would always be on terms that reflected the lessons she needed to internalize. Watching her grow into someone wiser and more thoughtful was proof that quiet strength often speaks louder than anger or revenge. In those final days of reconciliation, I also noticed the subtle ways Savannah had changed socially. Friends who had once been attracted only to her money now valued her effort, humility, and accountability. She had begun building relationships based on sincerity rather than wealth, and that was the real transformation. I felt a quiet sense of pride, not in having taught her a lesson, but in seeing her finally understand the consequences of her actions. For me, the greatest reward wasn't revenge, it was restoration. I had been hurt, dismissed, and betrayed, yet I emerged with my dignity intact. I had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for growth, both for Savannah and for myself. Watching her navigate her mistakes responsibly, facing reality without shortcuts, was a cathartic reminder that life can correct itself if handled with patience and wisdom. By the end, our relationship was rebuilt, stronger and more balanced than before. Betrayal had tested us, but it had also revealed the strength, resilience, and dignity that could survive even the deepest hurt. Savannah had learned her lesson, I had regained control of my life, and both of us emerged from the experience changed, but for the better. The story closed not with anger or bitterness, but with quiet triumph, clarity, and the lasting satisfaction of personal strength restored.